1 year after the January 6th assault on Congress, we talk about the rising tide of fascism and how a people's movement can defeat it. Welcome to this week's episode of the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker.
Unfortunately, so much of American politics is unbelievably provincial in the sense that it focuses on what's going on in the United States and turns a blind eye to a lot of what's going on elsewhere in the world, unless it's in order to weaponize certain issues like the rise of the Chinese economy or other such things. And so most American citizens or most people living in the United States don't even know that the US government, and this has been both Republican and Democratic administrations, has sought to overthrow, often successfully, more than 50 foreign governments since World War II, the majority of which were democratically elected. And so there is a deep history in this country of imperialism and the overthrowing of democratic popular governments in the name of supporting fascist dictatorships, authoritarian movements, anti-communist movements and shock troops around the world. And this is a bloody and horrible history that both the Republicans and Democrats have pursued conjointly. In fact, in one of the most telling statistics of the history of US support of death squads and other such things around the world, John Stockwell, a former member of the CIA, with 13 other former members of the CIA, did a study, and they found that the US was responsible, and the CIA more specifically, for the direct death of 6 million people between 1947 and 1987 when the study was conducted, right? So this is the scale that we're dealing with. I'd just like to relate that, though, back very quickly to your earlier exchange with Claudia, because I think it's also important that if the leaders of this movement, the financial backers, et cetera, are not prosecuted, then this means that the fascist threat is kept, right, within the confines of the bourgeois democracy, but it's always there, lurking in the margins, so to speak. And we have a precedent for this. The American Liberty League was organized in order to overthrow the US government, and we might get into this later in the conversation. But one important thing that happened, it was a proven conspiracy to overthrow the US government and establish a fascist dictatorship under when FDR was president. Did the Democrats prosecute? Did they go after the leaders of these movements? No, they found that there was a conspiracy to overthrow the US government and establish a fascist dictatorship, but they did not prosecute the leaders. They did not go after the financial backers. And the Liberty League, lo and behold, continued after 1934 and ran a Republican candidate for the next election against FDR. And that Republican candidate has been described by the great Grace Hutchins as being nothing less than a fascist. So this aspect of the narrative is very important for progressives to understand so that they're not hoodwinked by the false narratives of the Democratic Party, which is ultimately a bourgeois party and a party of the capitalist ruling class.
When you think about what the U.S. role in Latin America in particular, you look at what the U.S. actually did in Latin America and is attempting to do, and is attempted to do in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Honduras, certainly in Chile in 1973. When you think about it, we can both acknowledge that there is a difference between a bourgeois democratic form of government in the United States and, say, a fascist government. It's not that those two things would be unimportant. They would be significant, fundamental, a qualitative shift in American politics if it became a fascist regime. But for the people of Latin America or other countries or other continents, the impact of American policy feels a lot like fascism. It feels the same as what fascism would look like here at home, because it is fascism. It has been an export of American bourgeois democracy, is fascism in other places. And I think if people who are anti-Trump and wanting to fight against Trump righteously and fighting against the Republican sort of direction towards fascism and not recognize this fact, it ends up in the narrow channel of supporting the Democratic Party, which in turn exports fascism internationally. Fascism comes in the context of global capitalism, because capitalism is a global system. It's been a global system since the 14th century, really. Marx talks about that a great deal in his discussions with Kautsky about the evolution of the global market, the world market. And capitalism has evolved. It went through a period where colonialism was a policy, and then colonialism became, because colonialism was everywhere, part of the global system of capitalism, what Lenin called the highest stage of capitalism, leading inevitably to to war between the capitalists for the redivision of world markets or world colonies or spheres of influence. So while it has gone through evolutionary changes, we can see it is a global system. And there are elements of fascism, of modern day classic fascism, that are deeply rooted in sort of the foundational essence of this global system of capitalism. Again, I don't want to say there's no difference between bourgeois democracy and fascism. The form of government makes a great deal of difference in many, many ways. So we're not minimizing that. But when you think about the sort of characteristic features of what we think about when we think about fascism, the idea of racial supremacy, of militarism, the regimentation of labor, the excessive policing, the cult of violence, these are all characteristic features of fascism. But think about just the evolution of the United States or the so-called New World as part of this global system of capitalism. 12 million people from Africa were kidnapped and brought to the Americas as enslaved labor because there wasn't an already existing proletariat in South America or North America. The proletariat had to be imported. Some of it emigrated and some of it was enslaved and kidnapped. And the numbers are staggering. I mean, the number of people kidnapped from Africa and brought as enslaved people in chains was 12.5 million. 2 million of them died in that voyage. 2 million. 1.8 million died, it's estimated, in the voyage. The conditions were so horrible. So that meant 10 million enslaved people became the working class in the Americas, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in the United States. And you can't really have the proletariat be an enslaved mass population without somehow presenting an ideological explanation for their enslavement. And that's the function of white racism, of white supremacy, to justify this system of enslavement. And in what way is that different from Nazism? I mean, in fact, and I know you have written about and studied German fascism quite a bit, and the fascism in continental Europe, many of these fascistic ideas that were adopted by the fascist movement in the mid or late 1920s or 1930s are actually borrowed from the way the evolution of American capitalism with bourgeois democracy actually happened.
That's absolutely right, Brian. And it's so important that you're pointing this out because the Nazi war machine and the Nazi state itself was in many ways modeled off of the United States. And if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler points out quite explicitly that the state that has made the most progress in the direction that the Third Reich was headed in is the United States. And so there's a direct series of connections. In fact, he considered the Wild Wild East to be the Nazis' equivalent to the US's Wild Wild West. So just as the US settler colony was expanding its genocidal war against the indigenous population, the Mexican population, and subjecting Africans to chattel slavery and death, as you just pointed out, that whole war, the colonial war, was precisely what Hitler undertook against the savage barbarians of the East, right? And in particular, those in the Soviet Union, who are identified as part of this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy against the very principles of Western civilization. And so that history is very important to know, and it's one of the reasons that I think that the category of fascism, it's helpful to relate the category of fascism to kind of two different levels of analysis. And at one level, one very general sense, there's a fascist element to the history of capitalist colonial expansion. What I mean by that is that the capitalist ruling class used the state and vigilantes, militias, etc., in order to impose by force on the populations of the world exploitative and oppressive relationships of the capitalist system. And so the great Aimé Césaire pointed this out, right? We used to build concentration camps in the colonies. Everyone was fine with that. They start getting bent out of shape when it starts happening in Europe with the Nazis, right? But that being said, it is also important, if you're going to do conjunctural analysis, to highlight some of the specificities of what happened in the early 20th century. And so one of the lead-ups to what happened then was the financial crisis of the capitalist system, and the fact that many people around the world were recognizing that capitalism wasn't working for the masses of humanity. And this was coupled with the fact that in 1917, there was the first successful, workers' revolution that established a workers' state. And so capitalism had a very clear alternative. And so one way of understanding the specificity of fascism as it conjuncturally emerges in Europe in the early 20th century is at least in part a reaction formation to the ideological and economic crisis of the capitalist world, coupled with the threat of an alternative system, meaning a socialist system. And so capitalism had to go on the warpath. And that's why the capitalist ruling class funded the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and wanted him, as he did, particularly in the case of Hitler, to unleash the war of wars on the Soviet Union, on the greatest threat to the capitalist system at that point in time.
Gabriel, let me just stay with you for a second about what actually happened in the 1930s. The U.S. obviously went to war against Nazi Germany, and at the end of the war proclaimed that the victory against fascism was a triumph of bourgeois democracy. They didn't call it bourgeois democracy, of course, a triumph of democracy in America. But I know I've read your writings, and I know that you and Claudia have discussed this and taught about this. The U.S. ruling class was pretty pro-German when Hitler took over. And Hitler didn't seize power in 1933. There wasn't a Nazi revolution or a Nazi even counter-revolution. He was appointed. He was appointed by right-center political forces within the German capitalist establishment who had myriad ties with the Bush family, the Kennedy family, Henry Ford, and a lot of the U.S. bourgeoisie looked at Germany as a way to regiment and discipline or to destroy the growing labor movement of the 1930s. There wasn't like a profound anti-fascism within the American bourgeoisie. And of course, in Madison Square Garden in 1939, this was in New York, not Montgomery, Alabama, New York City. The garden was filled up with people saluting the swastika. Anyway, let's just talk about the American bourgeoisie. Yes, it ended up against Germany once the war started, but let's talk about their proclivities.
Yes, exactly. And the narrative around the U.S.'s involvement in World War II as being the good war, the war against fascism, etc., is so misguided because it misrepresents both the lead up to the war and the fact that the U.S. and the other bourgeois democracies of the West were not interested in forming a common front against fascism. On the contrary, and the Soviets, of course, were reaching out to the West and trying to do anything that they could to keep fascism at bay. The financial backers, of course, also included the major elements in the U.S. corporatocracy. Ford is the most famous because, of course, he was awarded the highest medal of distinction for a foreigner by the Nazi government, and they awarded Mussolini the same award the exact same year. And so it's misguided to think that somehow the capitalist ruling class or the political elite within the United States was opposed to Nazism and fascism into the lead up to the war. In fact, President Truman had said, well, let's just wait and let Germany and Soviet Union battle it out, and then we'll kind of jump in at the last second in order to support who's ever winning, and that way we make sure they massacre, one another as much as possible. And in many ways, that's kind of what happened in World War II. The U.S. ruling class was convinced, like the ruling class in the other bourgeois democracies, that the Nazi war machine was going to destroy the Soviet Union and finally get the job done, because it's exactly what they tried to do, 14 capitalist countries between 1918 and 1920, to strangle the red babe in its crib, according to Winston Churchill. They did not succeed in doing that. So Nazism, for certain members of the global capitalist ruling class, was the final solution to this form of class warfare. The U.S. did get involved in the war, though, after the Red Army, to the surprise of so many people at the time, started winning against the Nazi war machine, the undefeated Nazi war machine, and the most powerful war machine in the history of humanity at that point in time. And it not only started winning, it started marching westward. And so the threat was that since the bourgeois democracies were not preserving the population against fascism, that the socialists and the communists from the East would bring a true liberation not only from fascism, but also from the very roots of fascism, and that is the capitalist system. That could not be allowed to occur. Hence the necessity of the U.S. intervention and the opening up of the Western Front 2 years later. And so that larger history is so important to know, along with the fact that the U.S. and particularly the intelligence community was trying to negotiate deals with the Nazis, particularly Allen Dulles in Switzerland, in order to sign a peace agreement with the West so that he could release, or unleash the full force of the Nazi war machine on the Soviets. So all of this deeper history is very important to know, as well as the recuperation of so many members of the Nazi high command and the fascist high command that were either redistributed to Latin America through the various rat lines that were run. Many of them were brought to the United States, like the 1,600 Nazi scientists brought in Operation Paperclip. Others were sent elsewhere in the world. The same thing happened in Japan, for that matter. So there's a lot more to discuss here, but I'll just leave it at that we really have to understand that the bourgeois state as it functions, right, it does provide certain limits against the unleashing of extreme fascist violence against particular sectors of the population, but it keeps fascism there within close reach, if not, actually put into power, in order to make sure that at the end of the day, the capitalist ruling class remains in power.
2011. It started on September 17th. It became a fast-growing, spontaneous movement after the New York Police Department, talking about fascism, they suppressed one peaceful protest after another. They arrested 700 people on the Brooklyn Bridge, and everybody became suddenly aware of Occupy as a consequence of police repression. And Occupy encampments grew up all over the country. There was a really massive, spontaneous movement, and there were no demands. So people were chanting, "We are the 99%." Meaning there was a 1% that was responsible for the economic crisis that had, foreclosed 9 million families and made it impossible for young college graduates to get jobs in 2009 and 10 after the Wall Street meltdown. So Occupy was this really new, exciting, but peaceful movement. And the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, the PCJF here in Washington, D.C., they filed public records requests about why and how the Occupy movement was suppressed by the FBI, by the U.S. government at the federal level, the state level, the local level. The fusion centers, which were created after 9/11, became like the center of intelligence gathering and surveillance. I read all those documents. I reviewed those documents that were released by the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. And the FBI says over and over again, this is a peaceful movement. Now, remember, 7,000 people were arrested by the end of it, and it was suppressed within 4 months in a nationally coordinated crackdown. But the thing that jumped out at me, and I think that's so important for our conversation, is that even though the FBI and the fusion centers characterized Occupy as a peaceful movement, they used the anti-terrorism authorities that were granted to them after September 11th to carry out the surveillance and suppression of this peaceful movement. And I read the documents. It's amazing. Like if a group of people were meeting in a library to read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, they would say at 11 a.m., there are 13 people coming to our book club. And then the FBI reports at 2 p.m. that now there's 17 coming to the book group. I mean, it's that level of monitoring, all in the name of fighting terrorism or extremism. And now we have this new anti-terrorism unit that the DOJ, the Biden administration says, we're going to go after white supremacists and also anarchist groups. And I want to go back to where we started about this, because if the people who don't like Trump, and that would be all of us, or don't like Trump's politics in particular, which would be all of us, who reject his racism, his misogyny, his xenophobia against immigrants, his anti-worker positions, his anti-LGBTQ positions, if we reject all of that and yet embrace the Democratic Party or the bourgeois state or Merrick Garland's new domestic terrorism unit, we are walking ourselves into a graveyard. This is not the way to fight fascism. And any time the capitalist state uses anti-fascism or anti-terrorism as a way to strengthen its own hand, it should be understood by the left as a dire threat. So we have to find an independent way forward. If we reduce it to democracy, like bourgeois democracy versus fascism, we end up as anti-fascists supporting a system that is not only really undemocratic, but actually contributes to the rise of fascism because of its own failures. And so it's a dead end. It's a dead end to do that. And the only way to really frame the issue, as I think Claudia has done so eloquently, is to say it's not a struggle between, quote, democracy, ill-defined, and fascism, but actually it's between socialism and fascism, because the alternative to the organic existential crises of capitalism that give rise to fascism is socialism. And then the question is, how do you do it? How do you have socialism? How can we build it in this, the country of anti-communism? But we had, as she mentioned, Occupy in 2011. Then there was the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. Then there was the amazing, surprising takeoff of the Bernie Sanders movement and the re-legitimizing of the discussion about socialism. I mean, we could go on and on. There have been many mass movements against the Dakota Access Pipeline, Line 3, so many struggles. But there's all of these recurring fights that show there is a desire to fight, a desire to unite, a desire for social change. But at the same time, there's this rising tide of consolidated fascism. So these two sides meet each other. And it seems to me that the only answer, if we're serious about defeating fascism and recognizing in our analysis that it is organically connected, not to the form of government within capitalism, but to capitalism itself, that we have to provide a massive, multiracial, multinational, united front against fascism that's not purely defensive, not simply trying to stop fascism from coming to power, but that seeks real positive social change. And on that basis, unites the class, unites the working class. The Poor People's Campaign, have made such a contribution because they showed that 1 out of every 2 people in the United States is either in poverty or near poverty. They're Black people, they're Latino people, they're white people, they're Asian people, they're indigenous people. There's something that they have in common, and neither of the bourgeois parties can unite them, but the socialists, if they have the right program, can unite them. In other words, the defeat of fascism has to be organically connected to the struggle against capitalism itself, and that kind of a class struggle.
That's absolutely right, Brian. And I would just like to return quickly to one of the things that you said earlier. It is true that tactical defense of bourgeois democracies, insofar as they preserve some semblance of the rule of law and protect some progressives, is important, right? And there's the threat of a kind of ultra-leftist rejection of all aspects of bourgeois democracy. And so the tactical aspect of this is important, though, right? That the strategy, meaning the final goal and the objective, is not to have Biden in office or Obama or any of the other kind of sock puppets in the Democratic Party who are working for the capitalist ruling class. The overall goal needs to be the development of a socioeconomic system that is more egalitarian and serves people's real needs. So the real fight, the strategic fight against fascism, is and needs to be the fight for socialism. Now, the real question then becomes, how exactly do we do that in our particular conjuncture? And that would be, it'd be great to have even more time to explore this. But one thread I'd like to pick up on in the exchange between you and Claudia is the need that a united front be offensive, meaning that it goes on the offense, right? Not that it be derogatory or mean or things like this, but that there actually is a direction that is very clear, that is defined by the strategy, right? We can go on the offense because we know where we're headed. We're not simply on the defense and trying to keep someone in office who seems to be the lesser of two evils, but is nonetheless evil. The other thing that I'd like to add to that, though, is one of the important organizing strategies that has been used in the history of the fight against fascism is what's referred to as a united front from below. And what's meant by that is that the leadership of a lot of the organizations that are either in bed with the Democratic Party or close to the Democratic Party are trying to direct people into the graveyard of bourgeois democracies. But a popular front or a united front from below seeks to connect with the rank and file of all of these organizations in order to bring them into a common struggle for a progressive, socialist oriented political and economic system. And this is so important in our moment because a lot of the grievances that are being expressed by those who either are embracing Trump or embracing the Democratic Party, they have real grievances, like economic grievances. There's the COVID crisis, there's the unemployment, there's the housing crisis, etc. And so we as progressives need to fight a war for the hearts and minds of the American workers who have not been given their due by the system that exists, and bring them into a common united front from below in order to build the movement against fascism now, not simply waiting until it's either too late or they have too much power and things are so consolidated that we don't have the kind of level of mobility that we would need in order to really fight the fight and win.
And because they were so disillusioned with the Democratic Party, those workers were up for grabs. In other words, they if you say in advance anybody who votes for Trump is like a lost cause, that not only is it wrong, it just misses the boat tactically. Or if you denounce parts of the class because people are using language or words that are different from the acceptable, correct words of the left, and you stop talking to people and stop building with them and stop organizing with them, the left loses under that on that basis. The only way to form a united front from below is to be able to have a positive political program that meets the needs of all of those sectors of the working class and also respects people rather than, sort of denouncing people in advance. And finally, I'll stop here and then get your comments. The other thing that I think we must reject is the idea that fascism is going to be defeated by a small group of leftists who are going to go out and fight the small groups of fascists in the streets. Like, the way to defeat fascism is to mobilize the masses of people. Small group skirmishes don't do anything except give the state an excuse to stiffen its own instruments of repression. But when we think about what happened after George Floyd, 35 million people were in the streets, half of them for the first time. That was a very hopeful moment and obviously something that needs to be replicated and built into our strategy. A principled unity. That's so important because there are elements in the so-called left. Some of them are sort of independent leftists who say, look, let's find a point of unity with the right. Let's find points of unity with the right wing because the right wing is also, in some cases, anti-war or in some cases against the government or against the surveillance state. So let's unite with them, which I think is a recipe for disaster because you can't have principled unity with racists. You can't have principled unity with white supremacists or with those preaching hate against women or hate against the LGBTQ community. That's you can't make those like negotiable issues or second-rate issues. So the principled unity is to have things that we believe in, like anti-racism, like the fight against racism, like the fight for equality, like the fight against sexism and patriarchy, or any manifestation of discrimination and bigotry against the LGBTQ community. The principle of having the working class be a class that can emancipate itself. Like these are important principles, the principles of internationalism, where we don't say, oh, we're fighting for bread and butter issues at home, but to hell with Venezuela or to hell with Cuba. We can't be bothered. Or even worse, we're going to join the chorus against Cuba or Venezuela. So there has to be a principled unity. But what we're talking about, Gabriel, is reaching to other parts of the working class who may not yet be leftist, may not yet be socialist, may even be at the moment voting for Trump, and winning them over to a principled position of unity, which is possible. So in other words, the principled unity isn't unity for unity's sake with the right wing, but a unity based on principle that attempts to chip away at sectors of the masses who are right now under the spell or demagoguery of the right wing to bring them where their class interests really are. And that is always a struggle for every legitimate, valid, and viable socialist or communist movement, is to be able to achieve that.
I think it's so important to be able to identify the real needs, concerns, and problems of the working and toiling masses, and to recognize at the same time, as Claudia just pointed out, that they've been systematically subjected to the most extreme forms of ideological warfare and propaganda, meaning through the educational system, the mass media, and other such things. And so that contradiction between their grievances, their subjection to the violence of the capitalist system on the one hand, and then the ideological and propaganda machine that attempts to explain their very real grievances by identifying false causes, right? So the cause is immigrants, or the cause is China, or other such things. And part of the ideological war that we need to wage as progressives and socialists is the war for those hearts and minds of workers who do have very real concerns that need to be taken seriously, and they need to be freed as much as possible from the propagandistic capture by the capitalist ruling class and then the hench people who work for them. And that means bringing people into the struggle and trying to educate them about the real sources of the problems they're facing in the world. To do that, it also means that we're put in a situation where we have to act on so many of the forces that are operative in the world today and use them as the incredible teaching moments that they are. We're in a global pandemic where 415,000 people died in the United States last year. 2 died in China, 19 died in Cuba. This is an incredible teaching moment for us. It's the tale of two systems. Socialism works for addressing the healthcare needs and the vitality of the working masses. Capitalism does not. It throws you to the wolves and gives you ideological obfuscation as opposed to real education. And so a lot of the work that I think we need to do for this united front from below and the principled unity that both of you pointed out so importantly is the work of bringing the real interests of the working classes into this struggle to agitate, organize, and build power against not only the immediate threats of fascism, but the capitalist system that keeps fascism alive in order to discipline the working class.